Hi, good evening. We're going to start out in chapter 9 of The Secret Garden tonight. So I hope you enjoy. The strangest house anyone ever lived in. It was the sweetest, most mysterious looking place anyone could imagine. The high walls which shut it in were covered with the leafless stems of climbing roses, which were so thick that they were matted together. Mary Lennox knew they were roses because she had seen a great many roses in India. All the ground was covered with grass of a wintry brown, and out of it grew clumps of bushes which were surely rose bushes if they were alive. They were There were numbers of standard roses which had so spread their branches that they were like little trees. There were other trees in the garden, and one of the things which made the place look strangest and loveliest was that the climbing roses had run all over them and swung down long tendrils which made light, swaying curtains, and here and there they had caught at each other or at a far reaching branch and had crept from one tree to another and made lovely bridges of themselves. There were neither leaves nor roses on them now, and Mary did not know whether they were dead or alive, but their thin gray or brown branches and sprays looked like a sort of hazy mantle spreading over everything, walls and trees, and even brown grass, where they had fallen from their fastenings and run along the ground. It was this hazy tangle from tree to tree which made it all look so mysterious. Mary had thought it must be difficult from other gardens which had not been left all by themselves so long. And indeed, it was different from any other place she had ever seen in her life. "How still it is," she whispered. "How still." Then she waited a moment and listened at the stillness. The robin who had flown to his treetop was still as all the rest. He did not even flutter his wings. He sat without stirring and looked at Mary. "No wonder it is still," she whispered again. "I am the first person who has spoken in here for 10 years." She moved away from the door, stepping softly, as if she were afraid of awakening someone. She was glad there was grass under her feet and that her steps made no sounds. She walked under one of the fairy-like gray arches between the trees and looked up at the sprays and tendrils which formed them. "I wonder if they are all quite dead," she said. "Is it all a quite dead garden? I wish it wasn't." If she had been Ben Weatherstaff, she could have told whether the wood was alive by looking at it, but she could only see that there was only gray or brown sprays and branches, and none showed any signs of even a tiny leaf bud anywhere. But she was inside the wonderful garden, and she could come through the door under the ivy any time, and she felt as if she had found a world all her own. The sun was shining inside the four walls, and the high arch of the blue sky over this particular piece of Misselthwaite seemed even more brilliant and soft than it was over the moor. The robin flew down from his treetop and hopped about or flew after her from one brush to another. He chirped a good deal and had a very busy air, as if he were showing her things. Everything was strange and silent, and she seemed to be hundreds of miles from any one. But somehow she did not feel lonely at all. All that troubled her was her wish that she knew whether all the roses were dead, or if perhaps some of them had lived and might put out leaves and buds as the weather got warmer. She did not want it to be a quite dead garden. If it were a quite alive garden, how wonderful it would be, and what thousands of roses would grow on every side. Her skipping rope had hung over her arm when she came in, and after she had walked about for a while, she thought she would skip round the whole garden, stopping when she wanted to look at things. There seemed to have been grass paths here and there, and in one or two corners there were alcoves of evergreen with stone seats or tall moss-covered flower urns in them. As she came near the second of these alcoves, she stopped skipping. There had once been a flower bed in it, and she thought she saw something sticking out of the black earth, some sharp little pale green points. She remembered what Ben Weatherstaff had said, and she knelt down to look at them. "Yes, they are growing, tiny growing things, and they might be crocuses or snowdrops or daffodils," she whispered. She bent very close to them and sniffed the fresh scent of the damp earth. She liked it very much. "Perhaps there are some other ones coming up in other places," she said. "I will go all over the garden and look." She did not skip, but walked. She went slowly and kept her eyes on the ground. She looked in the old border beds and among the grass, and after she had gone round, trying to miss nothing, She had found ever so many sharp, pale green points, and she had become quite excited again. It isn't a quite dead garden, she cried out softly to herself. Even if the roses are dead, there are other things alive. She did not know anything about gardening, but the grass seemed so thick in some of the places where the green points were pushing their way through that she thought they did not seem to have room enough to grow. She searched about until she found a rather sharp piece of wood and knelt down and dug and weeded out the weeds and grass until she made nice, clear little paths around them. Now they look as if they could breathe, she said, after she had finished with the first ones. I'm going to do ever so many more. I'll do all I can see. If I haven't time today, I can come tomorrow. She went from place to place and dug and weeded and enjoyed herself so immensely that she was led on from bed to bed and into the grass under the trees. The exercise made her so warm that she first threw her coat off and then her hat, and without knowing it, she was smiling down onto the grass and the pale green points all the time. The robin was tremendously busy. He was very much pleased to see gardening begun on his own estate. He had often wondered at Ben Weatherstaff, where gardening is done, all sorts of delightful things to eat are turned up with the soil. Now here was this new kind of creature who was not half Ben's size, and yet had the sense to come into this garden and began at once. Mistress Mary worked in her garden until it was time to go to her midday dinner. In fact, she was rather late in remembering, and when she put on her coat and hat and picked up her skipping rope, she could not believe that she had been working 2 or 3 hours. She had actually been happy all the time, and dozens of the tiny pale green points were to be seen in cleared places, looking twice as cheerful as they had looked before when the grass and the weeds had been smothering them. I shall come back this afternoon, she said, looking all round at her new kingdom and speaking to the trees and rose bushes as if they had heard her. Then she ran lightly across the grass, pushed open the slow old door, and slipped through it under the ivy. She had such red cheeks and such bright eyes and ate such a dinner that Martha was delighted. 2 pieces of meat and 2 helpings of rice pudding, she said. Mother will be pleased when I tell her what the skipping rope's done for thee. In the course of her digging with her pointed stick, Mistress Mary had found herself digging up a sort of white root, rather like an onion. She had put it back in its place and patted the earth down carefully, and just now she wondered if Martha could tell her what it was. Martha, she said, what are those little white roots that look like onions? They're bulbs, answered Martha. Lots of spring flowers grow from them. The very little ones are snowdrops and crocuses, and the big ones are narcissus and jonquils and daffodillies. The biggest of all is lilies and purple flags. They are nice. Dicken's got a whole lot of them planted in our bit of garden. Does Dicken know all about them? Asked Mary, a new idea taking possession of her. Our Dicken can make a flower grow out of a brick wall. Mother says he just whispers things out of the ground. Do bulbs live a long time? Would they live years and years if no one helped them? Inquired Mary anxiously. They're things as helps themselves, said Martha. That's why poor folk can afford to have them. And if you don't trouble them, most of them will work away underground for a lifetime and spread out and have little ones. There's a place in the park woods here where there's snowdrops by the thousands. They're the prettiest sight in Yorkshire when the spring comes. No one knows when they was first planted. I wish the spring was here now, said Mary. I want to see all the things that grow in England. She had finished her dinner and gone to her favorite seat on the hearth rug. I wish I had a little spade, she said. Whatever does they want a spade for? Asked Martha, laughing. Aren't they going to take to digging? I must tell Mother that too. Mary looked at the fire and pondered a little. She must be careful if she meant to keep her secret kingdom. She wasn't doing any harm, but if Mr. Craven found out about the open door, he would be fearfully angry and get a new key and lock it up forevermore. She could not bear that. This is such a big, lonely place, she said slowly, as if she were turning matters over in her mind. This house is lonely, and the park is lonely, and the gardens are lonely. So many places seem shut up. I never did many things in India, but there were more people to look at, natives and soldiers marching by, and sometimes bands playing, and my Aya told me stories. There's no one to talk to here except you and Ben Weatherstaff. And you have to do your work, and Ben Weatherstaff won't speak to me often. I thought if I had a little spade, I could dig somewhere as he does, and I might make a little garden if he would give me some seeds. Martha's face quite lit up. There now, she exclaimed. If that wasn't one of the things Mother said. She says there's such a lot of room in that big place. Why don't they give her a little bit for herself, even if she doesn't plant nothing but parsley and radishes? She'd dig and rake away and be right down happy over it. Them was the very words she said. Were they? Said Mary. How many things she knows, doesn't she? Eh, said Martha. It's like she says. A woman as brings up 12 children learns something besides her ABC. Children's as good as arithmetic to set you finding out things. How much would a spade cost? A little one, Mary asked. Well, was Martha's reflective answer, at Thwaite Village there's a shop or so, and I saw little garden sets with a spade and a rake and a fork all tied together for 2 shillings. And they was stout enough to work with, too. I've got more than that in my purse, said Mary. Mrs. Morrison gave me 5 shillings, and Mrs. Medlock gave me some money from Mr. Craven. Did he remember you that much? Exclaimed Martha. Mrs. Medlock said I was to have 1 shilling a week to spend. She gives me one every Saturday. I didn't know what to spend it on. My word, that's riches, said Martha. That can buy anything in the world thou wants. The rent of our cottage is only 1 3 pence, and it's like pulling eye teeth to get it. Now I've just thought of something, putting her hands on her hips. What? Said Mary eagerly. In the shop at Thwaite, they'll sell packages of flower seeds for 1 penny each, and our Dicken, he knows which one is the prettiest and how to make them grow. He walks over to Thwaite many a day for just the fun of it. Does they know how to print letters? Suddenly. I know how to write, Mary answered. Martha shook her head. Our Dicken can only read printin'. If that could print, and we could write a letter to him and ask to go and buy the garden tools and the seeds at the same time. Oh, you're a good girl, Mary cried. You really are. I didn't know you were so nice. I know I can print letters if I try. Let's go ask Miss Medlock for a pen and ink and some paper. I've got some of my own, said Martha. I brought them so I could print a bit of letter to Mother on a Sunday. I'll go and get it. She ran out of the room, and Martha stood by the fire and twisted her thin little hands together with sheer pleasure. If I have a spade, she whispered, I can make the earth nice and soft and dig up weeds. If I have seeds and can make flowers grow, the garden won't be dead at all. It will come alive. She did not go out again that afternoon because when Martha returned with her pen and ink and paper, she was obliged to clear the table and carry the plates and dishes downstairs. And when she got to the kitchen, Miss Medlock was there and told her to do something. So Mary waited for what seemed like to her a long time before she came back. Then it was a serious piece of work to write to Dicken. Mary had been taught very little because her governesses had disliked her too much to stay with her. She could not spell particularly well, but she found that she could print letters when she tried. This was the letter Martha dictated to her. My dear Dicken, this comes hoping to find you well, as it leaves me at present. Miss Mary has plenty of money, and will you go to Thwaite and buy her some flower seeds and a set of garden tools to make a flower bed? Pick the prettiest ones and easy to grow, because she has never done it before and lived in India, which is different. Give my love to Mother and every one of you. Miss Mary is going to tell me a lot more, so that on my next day out you can hear about elephants and camels and gentlemen going hunting, lions and tigers. Your loving sister, Martha Phoebe Sowerby. We'll put the money in the envelope, and I'll get the butcher's boy to take it in his cart. He's a great friend of Dicken's, said Martha. How shall I get the things when Dicken buys them? Asked Mary. He'll bring them to you himself. He'll like to walk over this way. Oh, exclaimed Mary, then I shall see him. I never thought I should see Dicken. Does the want to see him? Asked Martha suddenly. She had looked so pleased. Yes, I do. I never saw a boy foxes and crows loved. I want to see him very much. Martha gave a little start, as if she suddenly remembered something. Now to think, she broke out, to think of me forgetting that there, and I thought I was going to tell you first thing this morning. I asked Mother, and she said she'd ask Mrs. Medlock her own self. Do you mean, Mary began, what I said Tuesday? Ask her if you might be driven over to our cottage some day and have a bit of Mother's hot oat cake and butter and a glass of milk. It seemed as if all the interesting things were happening in one day. To think of going over the moor in the daylight and when the sky was blue. To think of going to the cottage which had 12 children. Does she think Mrs. Medlock would let me go? She asked quite anxiously. Aye, she thinks she would. She knows what a tidy woman Mother is and how clean she keeps the cottage. If I went to see your mother as well as Dicken, said Mary, thinking it over and liking the idea very much. She doesn't seem to be like the mothers in India. Her work in the garden and the excitement of the afternoon ended by making her feel quiet and thoughtful. Martha stayed with her until tea time, but they sat in the comfortable quiet and talked very little. But just before Martha went downstairs for the tea tray, Mary asked a question. "Martha," she said, "has the scullery maid had the toothache again today?" Martha certainly started slightly. "What makes thee ask that?" she said. "Because when I waited so long for you to come back, I opened the door and walked down the corridor to see if you were coming. And I heard that far off crying again, just as we heard it the other night. There isn't a wind today, so you see it couldn't have been the wind." Said Martha restlessly. "They mustn't go walking about in corridors and listening. Mrs. Craven would be that they're angry. There's no knowing what he'd do." "I wasn't listening," said Mary. "I was just waiting for you, and I heard it. That's 3 times. My word, there's Miss Medlock's bell," said Martha, and she almost ran out of the room. "It's the strangest house anyone ever lived in," said Mary drowsily, as she dropped her head on the cushioned seat of the armchair near her. Fresh air and digging and skipping rope had made her feel so comfortably tired that she fell asleep. Chapter 10. Dicken. The sun shone down for nearly a week on the secret garden. The secret garden was what Mary liked calling it when she was thinking of it. She liked the name, and she liked still more the feeling that when its beautiful old walls shut her in, no one knew where she was. It seemed almost like being shut out of the world in some fairy place. The new books she had read and liked had been fairy storybooks, and she had read about some secret gardens in some of the stories. Sometimes people went to sleep in them for 100 years, which she had thought must be rather stupid. She had no intention of going to sleep, and in fact, she was becoming wider awake every day which passed at Misselthwaite. She was beginning to like to be out of doors. She no longer hated the wind, but enjoyed it. She could run faster and longer, and she could skip up to 100. The bulbs in the secret garden must have been much astonished. Such nice clear places were made round them, that they had all the breathing space they wanted, and really, if Mistress Mary had known it, they began to cheer up under the dark earth and work tremendously. The sun could get at them and warm them, and when the rain came, it could reach them at once. So they began to feel very much alive. Mary was an odd, determined little person, and now she had something interesting to be determined about, and she was very much absorbed indeed. She worked and dug and pulled up weeds steadily, only becoming more pleased with her work every hour instead of tiring of it. It seemed to her like a fascinating sort of play. She found many of the sprouting pale green points that she had ever hoped to find. They seemed to be starting up everywhere, and each day she was sure she found tiny new ones, some so tiny that they barely peeped above the earth. There were so many that she remembered what Martha had said about snowdrops by the thousands, and about bulbs spreading and making new ones. These had been left to themselves for 10 years, and perhaps they had spread, like the snowdrops, into thousands. She wondered how long it would be before they showed they were flowers. Sometimes she stopped digging to look at the garden and try to imagine what it would be like when it was covered with thousands of lovely things in bloom. During that week of sunshine, she became more intimate with Ben Weatherstaff. She surprised him several times by seeming to start up beside him as if she sprang out of the earth. The truth was, she was afraid that he would pick up his tools and go away if he saw her coming, so she always walked toward him as silently as possible. But in fact, he did not object to her as strongly as he had at first. Perhaps he was secretly rather flattered by her evident desire for his elderly company. Then also, she was more civil than she had been. He did not know that when she first saw him, she spoke to him as if she would have spoken to a native, and had not known that a cross, sturdy old Yorkshire man was not accustomed to salaam to his masters, and merely commanded by them to do things. "Thou'rt like the robin," he said to her one morning when he lifted his head and saw her standing by him. "I never know when I shall see thee or which side thou shalt come from." "He's friends with me now," said Mary. "That's like him," snapped Ben Weatherstaff, "making up to the women folk just for vanity and flightiness. There's nothing he wouldn't do for the sake of showing off and flirting his tail feathers. He's as full of pride as an egg's full of meat." He very seldom talked much, and sometimes didn't even answer Mary's questions except by grunt. But this morning he said more than usual. He stood up and rested one hobnailed boot over the top of his spade while he looked over at her. How long has the been here?" he jerked out. "I think it's been about a month," she answered. "That's beginning to do Misselthwaite credit," he said. That's a big fatter than there was, and there's not quite so yeller. They look like a young plucked crow when they first came into this garden. Thinks I to myself, I never set eyes on a uglier, sour-faced young'un. Mary was not vain, and she had never thought much of her looks, and she was not greatly disturbed. I know I'm fatter, she said. My stockings are getting tighter. They used to make wrinkles. There's the robin, Ben Weatherstaff. There indeed was the robin, and she thought he looked nicer than ever. His red waistcoat was as glossy as satin, and he flirted his wings and tail and tilted his head and hopped about with all sorts of lively graces. He seemed determined to make Ben Weatherstaff admire him, but Ben was sarcastic. Aye, there the art, he said. That can put up with me for a bit sometimes when there's got no one better. There's been reddening up their waistcoat and polishing the feathers this 2 weeks. I know what there's up to. Was courting some bold young madam somewhere, telling the lies about being the finest cock robin on Missile Moor, and ready to fight all the rest of them. Oh, look at him, exclaimed Mary. The robin was evidently in a fascinating, bold mood. He hopped closer and closer and looked at Ben Weatherstaff more and more engagingly. He flew to the nearest currant bush and tilted his head and sang a little song right at him. They thinks they'll get over me by doing that, he said, wrinkling up his face in such a way that Mary felt sure he was trying not to look pleased. The thinks no one can stand out against thee. That's what the thinks. The robin spread his wings. Mary could scarcely believe her eyes. He flew right up to the handle of Ben Weatherstaff's spade and alighted on the top of it. Then the old man's face wrinkled slowly into a new expression. He stood still as if he were afraid to breathe, as if he would not have stirred for the world, lest his robin should start away. He spoke quite in a whisper. Well, I'm danged, he said softly, as if he was saying something quite different. That does know how to get at a chap. That does. That's fairly unearthly, that's so knowing. And he stood without stirring, almost without drawing his breath, until the robin gave another flirt to his wings and flew away. Then he stood at the handle of the spade, as if there might be magic in it, and then he began to dig and said nothing for several minutes. But because he kept breaking into a slow grin now and then, Mary was not afraid to talk to him. Have you a garden of your own? She asked. No, I'm bachelor and lodge with Martin at the gate. If you had one, said Mary, what would you plant? Cabbages and taters and onions. But if you wanted to make a flower garden, persisted Mary, what would you plant? Bulbs and sweet-smelling things, but mostly roses. Mary's face lighted up. Do you like roses, she said. Ben Weatherstaff rooted up a weed and threw it aside before he answered. Well, yes, I do. I was learned that by a young lady I was a gardener to. She had a lot in a place she was fond of, and she loved 'em like they was children, or robins. I've seen her bend over and kiss 'em. He dragged out another weed and scowled at it. That was as much as 10 years ago. Where is she now? Asked Mary, much interested. Heaven, he answered, and drove his spade deep into the soil, according to what Parson says. What happened to the roses? Mary asked again, more interested than ever. They was left to themselves. Mary was becoming quite excited. Did they quite die? Did roses quite die when they were left to themselves? She ventured. Well, I'd got to like 'em, and I'd liked her, and she'd liked 'em, Ben Weatherstaff admitted reluctantly. Once or twice a year, I'd go and work 'em a bit, prune and dig about the roots. They run wild, but they was rich in soil, so some of 'em lived. When they have no leaves and look gray and brown and dry, how can you tell whether they are dead or alive? Inquired Mary. Wait till the spring gets at 'em. Wait till the sun shines on the rain and the rain falls on the sunshine, and then they'll find out. How? How? Cried Mary, forgetting to be careful. Look along the twigs and branches, and if it sees a bit of a brown clump swelling here and there, watch it after the warm rain and see what happens. He stopped suddenly and looked curiously at her eager face. Why does they care so much about roses and such? All of a sudden, he demanded. Mistress Mary felt her face grow red. She was almost afraid to answer. I want to play that. I have a garden of my own, she stammered. There's nothing for me to do. I have nothing and no one. Well, said Ben Weatherstaff slowly as he watched her, that's true. That hasn't. He said it in such an odd way that Mary wondered if he was actually a little sorry for her. She had never felt sorry for herself. She had only felt tired and cross because she disliked people and things so much. But now the world seemed to be changing and getting nicer. If no one found out about the secret garden, she should enjoy herself always. She stayed with him for 10 or 15 minutes longer and asked him as many questions as she dared. He answered every one of them in his queer, grunting way, and he did not seem really cross and did not pick up his spade and leave her. He said something about roses just as she was going away, and it reminded her of the ones he had said he'd been fond of. Do you go and see the other roses now? She asked. Not been this year. My rheumatics has made me too stiff in the joints. He said it in his grumbling voice, and then quite suddenly he seemed to get angry with her, though she did not see why he should. Now look here, he said sharply. Don't ask so many questions. Thou'rt the worst wench for asking questions I've ever come across. Get thee gone and play thee. I've done talking for today. And he said it so crossly that she knew there was not the least use in staying another minute. She went skipping slowly down the outside walk, thinking him over and saying to herself that queer as it was, here was another person whom she liked in spite of his crossness. She liked old Ben Weatherstaff. Yes, she did like him. She always wanted to try to make him talk to her, and she began to believe that he knew everything in the world about flowers. There was a laurel-hedged walk which curved round the secret garden and ended at a gate which opened into a wood in the park. She thought she would skip round this walk and look into the wood to see if there was any rabbits hopping about. She enjoyed the skipping very much, and when she reached the little gate, she opened it and went through because she heard a low, peculiar whistling, and she wanted to find out what it was. It was a very strange thing indeed. She caught her breath as she stopped to look at it. A boy was sitting under a tree with his back against it, playing on a rough wooden pipe. He was a funny-looking boy about 12. He looked very clean, and his nose turned up, and his cheeks were as red as poppies, and never had Mistress Mary seen such round and such blue eyes in any boy's face. And on the trunk of the tree he was leaned against, a brown squirrel was clinging and watching him. And from behind a bush nearby, a cock pheasant was delicately stretching his neck out to peep. And quite near him were 2 rabbits sitting up and sniffing with tremulous noses. And actually it appeared as if they were all drawing near to watch him and listen to the strange, low little call his pipe seemed to make. When he saw Mary, he held up his hand and spoke to her in a voice almost as low and rather like his piping. Don't the move, he said. It flight 'em. Mary remained motionless. He stopped playing his pipe and began to rise up from the ground. He moved so slowly that it scarcely seemed as though he were moving at all. But at last he stood on his feet, and the squirrel scampered back up to the branches of the trees, the pheasant withdrew its head, and the rabbits dropped on all fours and began to hop away, though not at all as if they were frightened. I'm Dicken, the boy said. I know thou'rt Miss Mary. Then Mary realized that somehow she had known at first that he was Dicken. Who else could have been charming rabbits and pheasants as the natives charm snakes in India? He had a wide, red, curved mouth, and his smile spread all over his face. I got up slow, he explained, because if that makes a quick move, it startles them. A body is to move gentle and speak low when wild things is about. He did not speak to her as if they had never seen each other before, but as if he had known her quite well. Mary knew nothing about boys, and she spoke to him a little stiffly because she felt rather shy. Did you get Martha's letter? She asked. He nodded his curly, rust-colored head. That's why I come. He stooped to pick up something which had been lying on the ground beside him when he piped. I've got the garden tools. There's a little spade and rake and a fork and hoe. Yeah, they're good uns. There's a trowel, too. And the woman in the shop threw in a packet of white poppy and one of blue larkspur when I bought the other seeds. Will you show the seeds to me? Mary said. She wished she could talk as he did. His speech was so quick and easy. It sounded as if he liked her and was not the least afraid she would not like him, though he was only a common moor boy in patched clothes and with a funny face and rough, rusty red head. As she came closer to him, she noticed that there was a clean, fresh scent of heather and grass and leaves about him, almost as if he were made of them. She liked it very much, and when she looked into his funny face with the red cheeks and round blue eyes, she forgot she had felt shy. Let us sit down on this log and look at them, she said. They sat down, and he took a clumsy little brown paper package out of his coat pocket. He untied the string, and inside there were ever so many neater and smaller packages with a picture of a flower on each one. There's a lot of mignonette and poppies, he said. Mignonette's the sweetest smelling thing that grows, and it'll grow wherever you cast it, same as poppies will. Them as will come up in bloom if you just whistle to 'em, them's the nicest of all. He stopped and turned his head quickly, his poppy-cheeked face lighting up. "Where's that robin as is calling us?" he said. The chirp came from a thick holly bush, bright with scarlet berries, and Mary thought she knew whose it was. "Is it really calling us?" "Eh," said Dickon, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "He's calling someone here he's friends with. That's the same as saying, 'Here I am, look at me. I want a bit of a chat.' There he is in the bush. Whose is he?" "He's been Weatherstaff's, but I think he knows me a little," answered Mary. "Eh, he knows thee," said Dickon in his low voice again, "and he likes thee. He's took thee on. He'll tell me all about thee in a minute." He moved quite close to the bush with the slow movement Mary had noticed before, and then he made a sound almost like the robin's own twitter. The robins listened a few seconds intently, and then answered quite as if he were replying to a question. "Hey, he's a friend of yours," chuckled Dickon. "Do you think he is?" cried Mary eagerly. She did so want to know. "Do you think he really likes me?" "He wouldn't come near thee if he didn't," answered Dickon. "Birds is rare choosers, and a robin can flout a body worse than a man. See, he's making up to thee now. Could not thou see a chap, he's saying?" And it really seemed as if it must be true. He so sidled and twittered and tilted that he hopped on his bush. "Do you understand everything birds say?" said Mary. Dickon's grin spread until he seemed all wide, red, curved mouthed, and he rubbed his rough head. "I think I do, and they think I do," he said. "I've lived on the moor with them so long. I've watched them break shell and come out and fledge and learn to fly and begin to sing till I think I'm one of them. Sometimes I think perhaps I'm a bird or a fox or a rabbit, a squirrel, or even a beetle, and I don't know it." He laughed and came back to the log and began to talk about the flower seeds again. He told her what they looked like when they were flowers. He told her how to plant them and watch them and feed and water them. "See here," he said suddenly, turning around to look at her. "I'll plant them for thee myself. Where's the garden?" Mary's thin hands clutched each other as they lay on her lap, but she didn't know what to say. For a whole minute she said nothing. She had never thought of this. She felt miserable, and she felt as if she went red and then pale. "Thou's got a bit of garden, hasn't thou?" Dickon said. It was true that she had turned red and then pale. Dickon saw her do it, and as she said nothing, he began to be puzzled. "Wouldn't they give thee a bit?" he asked. "Hasn't thou got any yet?" She held her hands even tighter and turned her eyes towards him. "I don't know anything about boys," she said slowly. "Could you keep a secret if I told you one?" "It's a great secret. I don't know what I should do if anyone found it out. I believe I should die." She said the last sentence quite fiercely. Dickon looked more puzzled than ever and rubbed his hand over his rough head again. But he answered quite good-humoredly. "I'm keeping secrets all the time," he said. "If I couldn't keep secrets from the other lads, secrets about foxes, cubs, and birds' nests, and wild things' holes, there'd be naught safe on the moor. Yea, I can keep secrets." Mistress Mary did not mean to put out her hand and clutch his sleeve, but she did it. "I've stolen a garden," she said very fast. "It isn't mine. It isn't anybody's. Nobody wants it. Nobody cares for it. Nobody ever goes into it. Perhaps everything is dead in it already. I don't know." She began to feel hot and as contrary as she's ever felt in her whole life. "I don't care. I don't care. Nobody has the right to take it from me when I care about it, and they don't. They're letting it die, all shut in by itself." She ended passionately, and she threw her arms over her face and burst out crying. Poor little Mistress Mary. Dickon's curious blue eyes grew rounder and rounder. "Eh," he said, drawing his exclamation out. The way that he did it meant both wonder and sympathy. "I've nothing to do," said Mary. "Nothing belongs to me. I found it myself, and I got into it myself. I was only just like the robin. And they wouldn't take it from the robin." "Where is it?" asked Dickon in a dropped voice. Mistress Mary got up from the log at once. She knew she felt contrary again and obstinate, and she did not care at all. She was imperious and Indian, and at the same time hot and sorrowful. "Come with me, and I'll show you," she said. She led him round the laurel path into the walk where the ivy grew so thickly. Dickon followed her with a queer, almost pitying look on his face. He felt as if he was being led to look at some strange bird's nest and must move softly. When she stepped up to the wall and lifted the hanging ivy, he started. There was a door, and Mary pushed it slowly open, and they passed in together. And then Mary stood and waved her hand round defiantly. "It's this," she said. "It's a secret garden. I'm the only one in the world who wants it to be alive." Dickon looked round and round about it, and round again. "Ah," he almost whispered. "It's a queer, pretty place. It's like as if a body was in a dream." And that is the end of those two chapters, and I will be back next time with chapter 11. Have a good night.